Hello and welcome. Today, I'm very pleased that we have a great program for you. This is part 5 of the SDV, Saxdor Morgan Vita Natural Disaster Recovery Hurricane Series. This is part 5, and today's program title is Hurricane Storm Surges and Flooding. How does this affect environmental policies? So the focus is going to be in environmental insurance coverage related to hurricane effects. So I'm very pleased that we've got Phil Willis here to talk with us. Phil, why don't you give yourself an introduction of what your background is, and then I'll do my own introduction, and we can start in with some back and forth between you and I.
Thanks, Tracy. I am a senior associate at Saxdor and Vita. I've been in private practice at SDV for a little over 5 years now. And in that time, my practice has focused on complex insurance litigation in the environmental area, as well as dealing with various builders risk cases. But a lot of it has done my writing involves environmental claims, environmental coverage, both with pollution environmental policies, as well as finding coverage under other policies as well.
So I'm Tracy Sachs. I am the founder of Saxdor Morgan Vita. I've been practicing about 37 years. This firm and myself, including Phil, we exclusively handle insurance coverage matters and solely on behalf of policyholders. We do this nationally out of a Northeast office, a Southeast office, and a West Coast office. So let's just jump right into it. So what are the environmental claims that we're going to be talking about here, and generally what type of policies are going to cover them?
Sure. So when you think about environmental claims, you can think back to where environmental claims really started from, which is in the 70s. The EPA starts putting out these various programs like CERCLA and other things to start basically assigning responsibility for cleanup of what they consider pollutants and pollution. So when you're thinking environmental, the first thing you want to think about is pollutants and pollution and what might be considered a pollutant under an environmental policy. The types of claims that you're going to be needing coverage for are things like cleanup costs, mitigation costs, as well as third-party liability, business interruption, claims. And so the first thing you want to think about in environmental claims is think about what actually happened and what do I need coverage for? And there's two sort of broad areas, which might be, one, you have coverage for your own losses that you might have suffered as a result of an environmental claim, and two might be liability that you have to others. And the second thing you have to think about is what actually caused that loss. And if it is something that could be classified as a pollutant, well, you're going to have to start thinking about what insurance policies you have and whether or not you have environmental coverage for that pollutant and for the costs associated with that. What a pollutant is a huge fight across the country. There's a sort of big split between the sort of two rival camps. And the first says, hey, a pollutant is really the sort of traditional environmental pollutant that the EPA was thinking about. Really bad stuff, things coming out of factories, waste products, all the terrible things you think about that Captain Planet would be cleaning up, basically. And so that camp says, hey, let's limit it to those things. Other states have found differently, and they look at, for example, in a commercial general liability policy, pollution exclusion, they say, hey, it could be anything that's an irritant or a contaminant. Well, by that metric, it could even be a little kid. Anyone with kids know they could be an irritant or contaminant. Doesn't necessarily make them a pollutant, but to certain states that follow that view, maybe it would. And so it's been extended to everything from dirt that gets into water to refuse from pig farms and all sorts of different things. Very typically, litigation on what a pollutant is can come around things like mold, oil and gas, asbestos, arsenic, silica, and lead paint, and all these different types of things. There'll be a lot of litigation on pollutant. So with that framework, you have to look at the different policies that might be in play. And obviously, typical policies that an ordinary person might have, like a homeowner's policy, may provide some coverage for these types of claims. And then on the business side of it, things like commercial general liability may have some coverage depending on what state you are and what camp you're in those states, all the way up to commercial properties. And then obviously the most extensive coverage for environmental claims, pollution or environmental policies.
So it's interesting. The background here, of course, is that some of the developments in environmental policies are relatively new in the life of the law. In other words, they all begin in sort of when CERCLA and all that begins, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, going forward. So we're going to talk about specific types of policies at this point. Maybe we'll dig in a little deeper on the history later, but let's talk about dividing. I always like to do insurance geography, and in the scheme of things, the world always divides out into first party and third party liability. It sounds like you're saying that we're going to have discussions of both first party policies that cover losses that to your own property, and also third party liability policies, which cover claims and suits against you for losses to someone else's property or bodily injury. Let's talk about the liability policies first. So what types of liabilities would be out there that someone might get sued for that you might turn to a liability policy for in the first place?
Sure. And we'll focus primarily our discussion on hurricanes and the type of damages associated with hurricanes that could ultimately lead to a third-party pollution or environmental claim. So looking first at the sort of more business side of it and the corporation side of it, I think the big concern with the hurricane is, well, first you have to think, what does a hurricane do? One, you know that there's going to be a lot of wind and there's going to be a lot of rain and potentially storm surges and flooding, right? So when you have those three things, it has the potential for tremendous property damage. And when you have property damage, it could lead to the release of materials and chemicals and things that aren't supposed to get out. So a great example is a case down in Texas involving damage from Hurricane Harvey, which knocked out the power at a power plant. And when that happened, basically a toxic cloud of all these various chemicals got released into the floodwaters of Hurricane Harvey, spread around. And actually, a Texas grand jury indicted the corporation for the release of that. So there's an example where the flood comes in, and right away, this power plant releases all these various toxic chemicals into the water. Now they have a potential liability for that. Another one, Hurricane Florence, again, a tremendous storm with high winds, lots of rain. And in a case in North Carolina, again, another energy company had over almost 40,000 tons of coal ash stored. And when the flooding occurred, basically all this coal ash got flooded into the river. So we now have an environmental claim potentially of how are you going to clean it up? Think about people that are fishing on the river. Well, you can't fish if there's coal ash in there now. So now maybe they have claims against the company. So when you have these things, you have to think about if our facility is breached in some way by the storm, or if it floods, what do we have stored in here that might flood out? And that's going to be the primary driver of claims against you. On the more personal or homeowner side, the type of third-party claims, you might think about, okay, with my house, what happens if the roof gets blown off my house and it lands over on the neighbor's house? Now, that might not be an environmental claim, but what if you have an older house? The roof is filled with asbestos. Now you've got asbestos covering your neighbor's property, and now they're suing you to clean it up. Your typical homeowner's policy might have an asbestos exclusion on it. So,
Phil, would that also apply, let's say that you had an oil tank in your basement and the flooding somehow it leaks out and goes into the groundwater into the neighbor's property?
Yeah, absolutely. So the neighbor might bring a suit against you there, but we know once something gets in the groundwater, it usually doesn't stay there. It keeps spreading, right? So you could potentially have an action from the state who says, hey, you didn't secure your oil tank securely enough. Now your oil tank has released into the groundwater. Maybe it got into a river. Maybe it's spread into the water table there, and now there's a claim against you to clean that up. And the thing that can be scary about environmental claims is the costs are often very high. They can be very expensive to do these cleanup efforts. Once pollutants get out, they're hard to get back. They're, think about all those pictures you see of oil leaks with the birds covered in it, right? And oil is more visible than some of these other things. When you're dealing with PCBs and asbestos and the other things, that they're often very small, hard to see. And so the costs associated with them, if you don't have insurance, can be very high.
So just to keep this grounded in some of the basics as well, it gets obviously a little bit more complicated when you've got a hurricane that causes severe damage that spreads to other properties. But the basic tenet there is it still has to cause damage to somebody else in order to have a liability policy be triggered, right? And the other thing, so is that, what about general liability policies? Don't they cover this? Don't they cover bodily injury and property damage to other people that caused by an occurrence during the policy period? Why is that not an issue here? Why are we talking about only environmental policies?
Sure. So the first thing, whenever you have any potential liability, any claim where it's coming from someone else against you, always your first line of defense should be your CGL, your commercial general liability policy. It's the most common policy that's probably out there for businesses to purchase, and it does provide broad coverage. The way we like to think about it is the CGL policy provides coverage for any liability claim out there in the world at any time possible, except for this, and this. And the insurance company essentially says, yeah, we'll provide you coverage, but we don't provide coverage for all these different things. And starting after the issuance of CERCLA and that, the insurance company started getting hit with these claims. And what started happening is insureds turned to them and said, hey, we need some coverage for this. We're getting cleanup claims. They're incredibly expensive. That's what we have insurance for. It's a liability claim essentially against us to clean up these damages or from someone else. And so they start adding on what's called a pollution exclusion onto the commercial general liability policy. And it's gone through a number of different iterations, from the absolute pollution exclusion, the total pollution exclusion, the no, we really mean it, we don't want to cover this pollution exclusion. And so over time, they've tried to restrict what the CGL policy covers. And sort of as I touched on before, what's really come down to now is the sort of two camps in the big split across the country, where some states hold, yeah, it's still limited only to traditional environmental pollution. So in those states, if you do have that sort of typical environmental pollution, well, you're still probably out of luck with pollution exclusion. Whereas in the other ones, depending on what gets released, you might have coverage if you can say, no, look, as a reasonable insured, I would have expected this to get covered. It's not like that typical thing. I'm not a factory producing, that type of thing.
So it's interesting in the history of things. For a while, of course, you had general liability policies that had no pollution exclusions. And then you had general liability policies that had varying degrees of escalating exclusion to the absolute and now the total exclusion, as you pointed out. But this divide between what's a pollutant and what's not a pollutant, the insurance companies have a reverse position. When the pollution exclusion was there, they tried to claim that everything was a pollutant. But after a period of time, they started selling the pollution policies to fill in the gap in the coverage for the general liability policy. Now that they've actually sold insurance coverage for pollutants, they're trying to narrow what's a pollutant. And now we want to claim that things aren't a pollutant if they're covered by a pollution policy, while simultaneously claiming when it's a pollution exclusion, oh, it must be a pollutant. And so that it might be that the language of each of these policies may vary on its definition of what a pollutant is. You could possibly have no coverage under either, coverage under both, or coverage under one. I think the intention would have been that they were trying to exclude it under the GL policy and cover it under the pollution policy. And I would just say, as a general tip, you should always, when deciding to buy specialty policies, be comparing them to your general liability exclusion. So if you buy a professional policy, you should look at the professional exclusion and make sure there's no gaps. If you buy an environmental policy, look at your GL policy, your general liability policy, and make sure that you've looked at the pollution exclusion and make sure there's no gaps there.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tracy, that coverage isn't all or nothing for one policy or another. You don't want to look narrowly at it and say, hey, probably involves a pollutant. Well, let me forget CGL, let me forget my commercial property, let me forget everything else. It must be just an environmental policy. And the reason it's important to keep these other policies in mind is that courts treat exclusions differently from coverage grants. And when you have these pollution exclusions that I'm talking about in a CGL policy, the court's always going to interpret them and look at them, what's excluded in favor of the insured, at least a little bit. And they're going to say, look, in order to prove the exclusion, the burden is actually on the insurance company. They have to establish that this is excluded. Now, when they sell a pollution or environmental policy, they're providing a coverage for that. And so now to establish it's a pollutant, it's now it's first the insured's burden, but again, with the exclusion, the courts are trying to limit what is excluded from coverage. Whereas an insurance coverage grant, they're trying to expand and say, look, you're providing coverage, it should be expansive. And so you run into situations where you have this exact same thing, and it might be excluded by the CGL, but covered by the environmental. Or you might be able to argue that, look, even though it's covered by my environmental policy, I still get coverage under the CGL, because you have to limit how the exclusion is read. We might want to limit it and say, look, a reasonable insured wouldn't consider this exclusion. I know I'm asking for coverage under my environmental policy, but that doesn't mean it's excluded by the CGL. You have to look at exclusions narrowly and interpret them, we argue, in favor of the insured.
That's a great point. So let's do this, because we probably, you and I would probably talk about this all day, but we're going to try and limit our program today. I want to move forward toward first party property discussion, but first party coverage, I should say. But I just want to say that you and I have worked together on a number of cases where, in fact, multiple policies may have been triggered by a single pollution event. In fact, a couple of the cases we worked on involved, it was rainwater that caused the overflow of a sewage plant, which caused pollution to escape into the environment. But there were issues not just under the pollution policy, but also under the general liability policy, and also under the professional liability policy. And all three of those policies ultimately ended up paying, even though all of them started out in a denial mode, and all of them pointing to the other policy that should pay. So just a strategic tip, as Phil pointed out, just to remember, always look at all of the coverages, always tender to all coverages that might have coverage. You don't want to end up having failed to give notice when you could have had coverage. And the second part is the general liability policy is usually much better on defense. It's going to pay for all of your defense typically without eating up your limits. And the other professional and pollution policies may not do that. And I would add to that the idea that keep in mind that it isn't just a pure look at the event and the policy. Since this is a liability claim, in other words, it's a suit against you, the most important thing to look at is what they've sued you for. Plaintiffs' lawyers can be very aggressive, and they might have given you 2 counts, 3 counts, 14 counts. If any one of those counts is not about pollution and therefore still covered under the GL policy, you might have coverage under both policies, and you may be saving your policy limits under the pollution policy by getting the defense out of the general liability policy.
Yeah, and one other thing to keep in mind there is that as great as the coverage afforded by pollution environmental policies often is, it will often come with either a high deductible or a self-insured retention. And it'll often be much higher than you'll have on your general liability policy. So if you're just relying on that, well, you're going to be paying a lot of the loss out of pocket yourself until you hit that threshold. And so if you can get that GL policy engaged, you might be able to bridge the gap until your environmental policy takes over the coverage.
Good point. So let's move forward though. So you talked already about what type of claims might come in against you that are related to a hurricane that might trigger pollution coverage. Now let's talk about what type of first party damage you might incur that after a hurricane that also might cause you to look to your first party policies for coverage.
Sure. So looking back at one of the examples I provided before where, the roof blows off and lands on the neighbor's property, and now they're suing you because you spread asbestos on their property. Well, you still don't have a roof. So you still have to pay to have your own roof replaced, let alone the cost to your neighbor. And so that's where your first party policies come into play, right? It's not just good enough to defend against lawsuits that come against you when a hurricane comes in. You also want to think about, well, what about my own damages? No one's suing me, so my third party liability policies say, okay, good luck with your own repairs. So you need your first party policies, and first party policies are things like on the homeowner's side, your homeowner's policy, and on a business, a commercial property, or in environmental and pollution policies, which very often also contain first party coverages. And those could be things like really initially a mitigation cost coverage, which is, hey, the first sign of a pollutant leaking out. Let's say you have a fuel tank again, it's leaking oil onto your own property. It's not spreading yet, but you say, I need to get on this right away. You might have mitigation coverage to jump in there and try to resolve the problem early. Or if you discover a problem that's been leaking underground for a long time, well, now you want to get in, remediate it yourself, and that's where your first party coverage comes in, and the insurance company will pay to remediate those damages, clean soil, whatever it might be. On the homeowner's side, following a hurricane, again, let's think back to what are the key things that happen when a hurricane rolls through. Again, it's wind, it's rain, and it's flooding in that combination. And we know that when you have water and water gets in where it's not supposed to, what always follows is mold. And thinking back, my aunt actually lives down in New Orleans, and following Hurricane Katrina, after they returned back to their house after having to flee the floodwaters, they came back to about 3 feet of black on their walls, and it was just covered in mold. And so, when you have those waters rise up and fill your house like that, you're going to likely get mold after that. And mold is often excluded in things like a homeowner's policy, or has maybe a very limited coverage grant, but there may be coverage there. And similarly, so an environmental policy could be very important. Similarly, for a business, your own commercial property policy may have exclusions for mold or limited coverage. So now you have to start thinking about, how am I going to piece my coverages together? And an important thing to think about with your own damages, when you have the combination of mold and water, the question becomes, well, what are the repairs I'm actually doing, right? You might look to your homeowner's policy and say, look, my homeowner's policy provides coverage for water damage, but it doesn't provide coverage for mold. And you think about, well, what am I doing to actually repair here? The actual costs associated with remediating the mold, maybe that's excluded, but all the sheet rock that needs to get ripped out, all that stuff, that may have to be done anyway, just because of the water damage. So you may be able to argue that you should get coverage for the water damage to all the affected areas, and limit the amount of the claim you're presenting as the mold damage. And that's why it's so important, when you have a claim like this, to start thinking about what your story of your coverage is, about what really happened, and present it in a way that's the most favorable for you, and present your damages to the appropriate policies, in the appropriate way. So in a lot of these cases, what ends up happening is you start having a big fight about what was the cause of the damages. And, you look at, was the damage caused by the wind? Was it caused by the rain? Was it caused by the mold, or just the water? And so, again, how the courts look at what causation of the damages are, and again, how you present it to the insurance company is important. It's much easier to take some time and present a story than a year later down the line of adjusting the claim, say, no, hold on, I actually meant to say this, and that I actually meant to present this as a water damage claim, not a mold claim. Well, now you sort of backed yourself into a bit of a corner. So again, the first thing to do is to really think comprehensively about your strategy and how you're going to present that first party claim.
Yeah, that's a great point. I always like to emphasize, if I can, that the insurance company never sends you a letter about whether you have coverage without having read the policy and thought through what the exclusions are. The policyholders often make the mistake of not understanding what the policy says, and then loosely talking about in emails or otherwise how they characterize it, and they may be characterizing a way that isn't totally accurate, but leads them right to an exclusion. And if they had thought about it more, they would have written it a little differently. One of the things that you point out was about the idea of two different causations, whether it be mold or water or wind or rain or other things. One might be excluded, one might be not excluded, one might have a deductible, one might not. We had done, I think the second of this series is about concurrent causation, and those more interested in that particular topic can look a little more deeply. It wasn't specifically about pollution policies, but the same issue arises over and over again in this field. But I had another question along these lines here, that the difference, you talked about, homeowners policy or just your typical commercial property policy for businesses which may include business interruption coverage and other things. Are there? It seems like the business, the commercial property policies often simply cover property damage or business interruption associated with that property damage. But it seems like the pollution policies may go a little further in that they aren't limited to something that's specifically associated with property damage itself, but cleanup costs, remediation costs, and other definitions, and including maybe costs associated with government activity, government action against you because of a pollution event. Could you just kind of expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So again, with the commercial property policy, one thing to keep in mind is, like a CGL, very often they will have a pollution exclusion on them. So depending on, again, where you are, what type you have, your coverages under that may be limited. But environmental policies really do go above and beyond that. And thinking of cleanup costs, you may, when you have a situation of oil, let's use oil as an example, leaking out onto the ground, you may be in a fight with the insurance company of whether there's property damage or how much, what's damaged and how much you need to, get fixed. But if you have cleanup cost coverage, well, that's exactly what it's tailored for in environmental policy. It's to go in, remediate all this, oil that's leaked out. Let's find it, get it out of the soil. It covers all the testing costs associated with that. Testing for these various things can be very expensive and can be very important in what it covers. This brings to mind, a case I've worked on following a hurricane where all these number of housing had just tremendous both water damage from just torrential rains occurring, but also mold. And so when that happens, one of the things you have to do is go in and find out what's behind the walls, because it might look okay from the outside, but you might have water running in from the roof down through behind the walls. And now you could have potentially mold growing back there. And so you have to do something called moisture mapping, right? And so an environmental policy might cover that and might say, look, we understand that you have to find the mold to get it out. And so you have to find out where the water is, right? Now, your commercial property policy might not cover something like that. They might say, no, show us where the damage is. We don't care how you find it, but show us the damage, then we'll provide you coverage. Whereas an environmental policy might go a step further and says, no, we'll actually give you, we'll actually provide you some money to go and find the damages themselves, and then we'll provide you the coverage to remediate that. And it makes sense because, again, these damages compound. And what often happens with environmental claims is it's something that either you don't see or it can build up for a long time. And imagine that your fuel tank is leaking in your house. You might not know about that potentially for years, right? You may just think you keep turning your heat too high, but tremendous amounts of pollutants could be leaking out in what we call latent fashion, in something that you don't see, something behind the wall, something into the ground. And it'll be only years later that happens. So actually being proactive and going out and finding what the problem is and remediating it is often something that environmental policies provide above and beyond just a commercial property policy.
Very helpful. So I think you probably touched on a lot of things that are in the next question, but maybe just either expand a little bit or highlight them. But what are the sort of the key issues and exclusions and conditions that are going to be pertinent when you have a hurricane, and then we have either first party damage or we have third party liability claims against us? What are the issues that you would be most likely to focus on?
Well, the first thing that any insured should always be thinking about with any claim, not just with a hurricane environmental, is notice. And we can't stress this enough. Notice, I'll steal one of your lines, Tracy, is like voting in Chicago. Do it early and often. Maybe right now, not the best joke to make, but it really is true.
Right now, as we do this on November the 12th, it might be, as they say, too soon.
Yeah, but what's not too soon is providing notice. As soon as you might have a claim, just provide notice to everyone. It's not going to hurt you to later come back and say, you know what, we're not actually going to be making a claim under this policy. But what you don't want is to run into a situation where it's years later, you've incurred millions of dollars in damages, and now suddenly you have to turn to the insurance company and have a fight about whether they've been prejudiced by you're not providing notice to them. So that's always the first thing. The next thing, again, is to think about what were the causes of the damages. And, like I talked about, some commercial property policies will have what's called a named storm deductible. And if it's a named hurricane, your deductible goes through the roof. And so now you're going to have a lot higher damages before you actually start getting coverage, right? Sometimes there'll be issues of whether it's caused by a storm surge or something else. So you want to start thinking about what the roadmap is for your coverage and how you present your claims. One of the other partners here, Ed, showed me the story about a case he worked on where during a hurricane, this homeowner's house just got completely destroyed. And he went back and, after evacuating, comes back, it's just gone. And he makes a claim to the insurance company and they say, nope, that's excluded. It was a storm surge and that's excluded by our policy. And the homeowner says, well, hold on. We don't know that. I think it was the wind that knocked it down and that's covered. And ultimately the court had to look at those two, and obviously no one was there to really know what happened. And the court said, well, look, in order to exclude it, the burden is on the insurance company, and they couldn't prove that it was the water as opposed to the wind. And so they found coverage. So, again, you want to think about which policies I have, who's going to have the burden to prove what parts of it, who has to prove that an exclusion applies, who has to prove that there's coverage in the first place. And so as you're coming up with your coverage strategy and the different policies you're tagging, you want to keep those different things in mind as well.
So it's worth saying that you mentioned Ed. It's Ed Dornberger, our more senior partner here. And he actually, it's interesting you mentioned that because he also had another case involving the Houston Convention Center that went all the way up to the Second Circuit and back down again, in which he was ultimately successful under a builder's risk policy with similar issues about the fight, whether or not it was wind damage or rain damage that got into a building under construction, in that case, the Houston Convention Center. Yeah,
it's, how you classify that claim from the start is important. If you just say, oh yeah, we had, wind damage here and you have a wind exclusion, well, now you've already set yourself up on the wrong foot. So it's important from the start to be thinking about what issues of causation you have, what exclusions you might have. And if you do have multiple causes, you want to look at whether, again, like you said, the other topic touched on issues of concurrent causation, whether you have favorable case law on that or else. The last thing I'll say you want to think about, and this kind of echoes what I've said, is we call it bucketing coverage. And for example, in an environmental policy, you're going to have different coverage areas. You might have mitigation costs, transportation costs, cleanup, remediation, and they each have their own sublimits and provide coverage. So, when you're presenting your claim to the insurance company, you don't want to rely on them to decide what part of your claims are covered or uncovered under which coverage areas. And so you want to try to present it in a comprehensive way to say, hey, these costs are covered here, these costs are covered there. And so by presenting it that way in the first part, you're already reducing sort of the insurance company's ability to sort of limit what you have. And now you've got a consistent plan all along.
That's terrific. I think that you've fairly comprehensively covered this in a very short period of time. Anything you wanted to add as to sort of a closing remark before we shut down the session?
No, I appreciate the chance to talk about it. It's an interesting issue, and we keep seeming to have more and more hurricanes. So, as claims arise, I hope that everyone watching this will keep us in mind with the expertise that we have in this field to assist in these claims. They're very complex and they're difficult, but that's what we like.
So thank you everybody for tuning in for this. We always enjoy doing this. This is what we love to do. We're somewhat insurance geeks, and we don't apologize for that. So thank you.